Hello, my name is Justin Foster, and today I will be discussing the longevity and effectiveness of consensus and inoculation messages at shifting attitudes towards climate change. Climate change is currently one of the most pressing global issues, but much of this issue revolves around climate communication and increasing public support for climate policies. In response to this issue, the Gateway Belief Model, or the GBM, essentially proposes that there is a causal association between changes in perceived scientific consensus, or PSC, and a subsequent change in other key beliefs about climate change. The diagram on the right shows this relationship and also the theorized indirect effect that PSC has on support for public action. The simplest proposed means for shifting PSC is through a consensus message, which is the simple statement that there is a 97% consensus among publishing climate scientists that human-caused climate change is happening. This message has been shown to cause a significant increase in PSC without any evidence of psychological reactance. In order to build resistance to misinformation online, some researchers have proposed an inoculation theory approach, which includes two steps: a preemptive warning about the presence of misinformation and the refutation of an anticipated argument. Research has shown that an inoculation method preserves a majority of the consensus message's effect when directly countered by climate change misinformation. The question that was asked at the start of this study was, how effective are consensus and combined consensus inoculation messages at shifting attitudes towards climate change over a 3-week period? It was hypothesized that if exposed to either message, PSC and certainty of the estimate would increase after a 1-week delay and decrease slightly each week afterwards, but still with a longevity of at least 3 weeks. Measures other than the PSC and certainty, which will be described on the next slide, while hypothesized to increase, were not expected to increase by a detectable amount. It was further expected that the combined message would have a greater effectiveness and longevity than the consensus message. Due to a small sample size, only 2 treatments were viable, and it was determined that the best 2 treatment options were a consensus message and a combined message. The combined message included the consensus message as well as an inoculation message, pulled from a previous study. In addition, an educational segment about misinformation in the media and online was included in the combined message with the intention of increasing critical thinking towards scientific issues. PSC is the most important measure as the core of the GBM. Certainty of the PSC estimate was also measured on a 7-point Likert scale as a tool for possibly detecting more subtle changes in PSC estimates. In addition, belief in climate change, or BCC, belief in climate science, or BCS, awareness of consequences, or AC, and support for emission reductions, or SER, were also measured in the study. Each of these measures corresponded with a group of 5 or 6 questions from a previous study, each measured on a 7-point Likert scale and averaged together to get the value for a particular measure. Participants started off by completing a pre-survey, then were randomly assigned to read either the consensus message or the combined message, and then completed 3 post-surveys at 1-week intervals. This process is shown in the flowchart below. The pre-survey and post-survey included identical questions as described earlier, but in addition to the previously described questions, the pre-survey also gathered the political party identification of participants, so that correlational calculations could be conducted. It was decided that participants would not be directly exposed to misinformation because it was not compatible with the multiple post-surveys approach. In addition, it was theorized that the longer span of time of this study could allow for participants to be exposed to misinformation at a natural rate. 90% confidence intervals were calculated for all measures during each measurement time, as shown below. As indicated by the graph on the left, PSC measurements for the consensus message were significantly higher than the pre-survey in week 2 and week 3, but not in week 1. Considering that it was expected PSC would increase in the first week and decrease or remain unchanged in the following 2 weeks, it is likely that there was an increase in the first week and that the small sample size just reduced the detection power in this study. The graph on the right indicates a similar trend for certainty in the consensus message group, with only week 2 and week 3 values being significantly higher than the pre-survey value. This is likely due to similar reasons. These trends show no indication of a decline over the 3-week period and provide some evidence to show that the consensus message has a longevity of effectiveness of at least 3 weeks. Looking at the combined message group, it can be seen in the left graph that PSC significantly increased after the first week, and this increase was maintained through all subsequent weeks of measurement. Although the week 2 measurement is actually not significantly higher than the pre-survey measurement at a 90% confidence level, it will be treated as if it is, because it is significantly higher at the 88% confidence level, and it's highly unlikely that the measure was actually higher in week 2 and week 3 than the pre-survey, but not during week 2 as well. Difficulty in detecting this increase was mainly caused by a high standard deviation in the PSC estimates within the sample. A similar but more obviously significant trend was observed for the certainty measure in the graph to the right, which significantly increased between the pre-survey in week 1 and maintained the increase through week 3. For measures other than the PSC and certainty, no significant changes were observed. However, the confidence intervals for all measures shifted upwards slightly between the pre-survey and week 3 for all measures within both treatment groups, with one exception. This is not strong evidence that any messages caused upward shifts in these measures, but it suggests that future studies should look further into possible effects on these variables. In addition, correlational calculations were conducted between political party identification and pre-survey to week 3 changes in each measure. For the consensus message group, 2 mild to moderate positive correlations were observed, and for the combined message group, 4 were observed. Since all possibly meaningful correlations were positive, there is some indication that these messages may have had a greater effectiveness among Republicans than Democrats. However, it is also possible that this resulted from a greater upwards mobility of measures among Republicans due to lower average starting values. As hypothesized, PSC and certainty estimates did show evidence of a significant increase in 3-week longevity for both messages. The absence of any significant decreases over time, although unexpected, is more promising for the longevity of the gateway belief model. It was also hypothesized that the combined message would be more effective than the consensus message, but there is no evidence to suggest any differences between the two messages. The conclusions of the current study support the new finding that consensus and inoculation messages have a longevity of at least 3 weeks, which supports the practical application of climate messaging rooted in these approaches. By assessing participants over this span of time, the study was able to assess these messages in a more realistic and less controlled context, where exposure to misinformation was varied between participants as it would be in a real-world context. Future studies should begin to shift more towards this model, which better simulates real strategies that will eventually be employed to shift public opinion about climate change policy issues. The use of a small sample size prevented the use of more than 2 treatments, decreased the validity of results, and reduced the detection power of calculations. Because the sample was conveniently sampled, there is also some degree of bias in the results, because the sample overrepresented younger and more liberal individuals. Prior to conducting calculations, one participant's data in the combined message group had to be removed from the data set. It was assumed that this data was an outlier because it was the only individual out of all 26 participants for which a message had a longevity of only 1 week. Treating this individual as an outlier is an issue, however, because it is expected that these messages will have a shorter longevity for some individuals in the population. A replication study with a much larger sample size would likely be able to observe this phenomenon more often, such that it wouldn't have to treat this occurrence as an outlier. It's also possible that the assessment of longevity in the current study was affected by weekly measurements, which may have influenced retainment of learned information by functioning as a reminder. Therefore, it may be useful to replicate this study with only 2 measurement periods, 3 weeks apart, in order to further validate conclusions. Following the current study, the most obvious continuation would be a replication study with a much larger and more representative sample. This would overcome most of the limitations previously described by increasing detection power and the significance of findings. This could allow for changes in BCC, BCS, AC, and SER to be detected, and could also allow for differences between the consensus and combined messages to be observed. Testing the effectiveness of these messages over a longer time span would also be useful in assessing long-term effectiveness, since longevity of over a month would provide evidence for long-term memory consolidation. In addition, more robust correlational calculations can be conducted if a more effective method is used for measuring ideological affiliation, such as a Likert scale rather than simple political party identification. Although the results of the current study support the gateway belief model and inoculation theory, it is crucial that future replication studies confirm the longevity of these strategies with more robust conclusions. Thank you for attending my presentation. Here are my image citations, as well as my references.